If you're a physician that is a participant in a small medical practice in a competitive environment, you need to at least consider the possibility of forming and being part of a large group practice, otherwise known as a supergroup. Hi, my name is Dan Frier. I'm one of the founding members of Frier Levitt. We are a health law firm. We're located in Pine Brook, New Jersey, but we have clients all over the country, and we focus on the provision of services to healthcare providers, physicians, surgery centers, imaging centers, the formation of supergroups. We also represent providers in the life sciences industry, including specialty pharmacies, compounding pharmacies, wholesalers, distributors, etc. Today we're going to talk about physician integrated group practices, otherwise called supergroups. In healthcare, a supergroup is a group of physicians who were previously successful in their own right, their own smaller practices, that have decided to join forces to form a single group with a single tax ID number to practice medicine as a single practice rather than as individual small practices. Why form a supergroup? Why do physicians form supergroups? And there are a variety of reasons. It's helpful to understand what's going on in the marketplace, the practice of medicine. Physicians who are the only individuals in the healthcare spectrum that know how to treat patients, the full panoply of care, those individuals, physicians, have been left out of the discussion in many cases in terms of the business and even now the practice of medicine. You have hospitals now that are competing with medical practices, hospitals that are forming their own captive practices or directly employing physicians and practicing medicine. Hospitals claim that physicians are competing with them, but the reality is physicians aren't opening up hospitals. Hospitals are competing with physicians. And it's been very difficult for physicians to compete against hospitals because hospitals have an advantage. They can pay physicians more than a private practice can pay because the hospitals also have the financial benefit of receiving the inpatient referrals. And that additional boost of money allows them to, even in many cases, experience a loss in their medical practice side. They can pay doctors more than they can justify from the profitability of physicians, which is a whole different discussion and raises some significant legal issues, but it is the reality of what's happening. So there are also private equity groups. There's nothing wrong with private equity, but some private equity groups are directly competing with practices by buying up and managing large groups, non-physician run. You have essentially a business MBA CEO type that's operating and running the practice of medicine. This is in direct competition with local physicians that are trying to operate their practice without the financial resources and sophistication of the private equity groups. So in order to combat these forces, many physicians, whether it's single specialty or multi-specialty, have joined forces to create something that's large and has greater negotiating leverage and greater sophistication. So one reason that I think I've just gone over to form a supergroup is to combat some of these competing forces within the community with respect to the practice of medicine. Another reason is to enhance negotiating leverage with payers. And I'm not talking about just simply bullying payers into paying higher fee for service. I'm also talking about engaging in value-based negotiations with payers. Negotiating episodes of care, negotiating bundled payments, taking on risk eventually. These things cannot really be effectively done with small practices that don't have sophisticated enough people, don't have sophisticated enough technology, and don't have enough population under their care to make a difference. Payers aren't interested in going to a two-person group and negotiating episodes of care agreements. They are interested in going to a 50-physician group and negotiating these things. Another advantage of a supergroup is the sharing of resources. For example, whereas a small practice would not necessarily be able to afford an MBA level CEO or chief operating officer, a supergroup consisting of 50 physicians or more, or 20 physicians, whatever it is, can often afford more sophisticated administrators that are then shared among the practices, like fractional ownership in a 747 versus individual ownership in a propeller Cessna, as an analogy. Another advantage that is often discussed is the ability to utilize ancillary services. So whereas small practices can legally own ancillary services such as physician-owned pharmacies or imaging centers or labs, it's often very difficult for them to have enough volume to support those ancillary services. Large practices that comply with Stark can and do very often own their own ancillary services, and that can be profitable, and it can also increase the patient experience as well as be beneficial for value-based healthcare in terms of negotiating a more complete bundled payment, for example. Another example of an advantage that is often overlooked in the formation of a supergroup is just the level of overall sophistication that a physician who's part of a small practice can benefit from when he or she joins a large practice that's much more sophisticated. As an example, I sit on the boards of 2 supergroups. I say sit on the boards. I'm not a board member. I sit as the attorney, and I attend every monthly meeting in these 2 groups. And I can tell you that the level of discourse during these meetings is like no other, small practice meeting that I've ever been to. Large, sophisticated practices are discussing things that small practices wish they were discussing. They're discussing things like population health, value-based healthcare, partnering with EHR systems, partnering with practice management systems to develop better products. There's a level of sophistication that a physician who's used to a small practice will experience in a properly formed supergroup, and it's a huge and often unheard of advantage that should not be discounted. Another advantage of a supergroup is resisting local hospital influences. As most of you know, if you're physicians in an area where hospitals have been aggressively seeking to employ physicians, hospitals are now in competition with you. Hospitals will tell you as physicians that you're in competition with them, but the reality is you're not opening hospitals, they're practicing medicine. And hospitals that practice medicine have an advantage over you because they can afford to pay their physicians more than you can afford to pay your physicians because they are benefiting from the inpatient referrals. And so that revenue offsets the losses that they might experience by paying greater amounts to physicians. A supergroup will allow doctors in a particular geographic area, if properly formed, to resist those forces by virtue of the provisions in the operating agreement that would limit the ability of physicians to leave and go work for a competing practice, such as a hospital practice. And that can be, in some areas, a very important reason to do this, to resist these powerful hospitals that are competing with the practice of medicine. One consideration in forming a supergroup is whether to form a multi-specialty or single specialty group. It's certainly, in most cases, easier to form a single specialty group. For example, I work with several large gastroenterology practices, OBGYN practices, single specialty, in orthopedic practices. The reason it's easier to form a single specialty group is that all the players have one thing in common, that is the area of practice. They build the same CPT codes. They have the same issues. They need the same ancillary services. And so in terms of getting the thing off the ground, a single specialty is easier. Multi-specialty, however, is arguably a more powerful type of supergroup because you can provide services throughout a larger spectrum of care. And you can start to get into things such as population health, perhaps more effectively with a multi-specialty group than a single specialty group. If the single specialty is a specialty group, like surgery or a retina group or some other subspecialty group that depends on referrals from primary care physicians, a single specialty group can have disadvantages over the long run because if you don't control your referrals, then those referrals can be sucked away by hospitals, private equity. They can form their own group, employ their own subspecialists. So you have to be wary of that. One model that many of our clients have adopted is to start off as a single specialty group and eventually bring on, either through membership or acquisition or employment, other specialties that refer to the original specialty that started the group. That will shore up the base for the subspecialists in a way that increases the likelihood of their future success and avoids a situation where the referring doctors are pulled away by hospitals or private equity groups or form their own group and employ their own subspecialists to compete with the subspecialty group. That can be done over the course of time, or it can be done at the onset of the formation of the group. Let's talk about structure for a moment. So as I mentioned earlier, a supergroup by definition has one tax ID number. There are exceptions to that. For example, if a group spans across state lines, many states require that any practice within that state operate through a separate entity that's registered with that state. So you have to, by definition, then register a new tax ID number. So a supergroup could actually consist of more than one entity if it's required by state law. And interestingly, Stark will still recognize that as a single group practice as long as those two states are contiguous to one another and you meet the other requirements of the in-office ancillary services exception, which is beyond the scope of this particular discussion. The way that we have typically formed and seen these supergroups formed is through what we call an integrated group practice model consisting of various care centers. And what that basically means is that each practice that joins the supergroup, the old entities, the legacy entities we call them, stop practicing medicine as of the go-live date, and they begin to practice and operate under the new tax ID number. But each practice comprises a separate care center, which is like a division within the new entity. A care center does not have its own distinct legal identity. It does not have its own tax ID number. It's just a division within the company. And it's a division for purposes of determining where care is provided to patients. Usually the care center is associated with one or more offices. It's associated with one or more physicians that operate out of that care center and that share the profits generated by that care center. At the heart of the supergroup is the Central Business Office, or CBO. A CBO is the administrative offices of the supergroup where billing and collections are performed, where accounts payable are performed, where the administrative staff, such as the chief operating officer, possibly a CEO, whether it's a physician CEO or a non-physician CEO, resides and operates. It's the functioning arm of the organization. It's not a separate entity. It's part and parcel of the practice, but it happens to be usually centralized, especially with larger groups. They have a central office with meeting rooms and things of that nature. The CBO has certain expenses that are associated with it. Those expenses are allocated among all the care centers based upon a formula that's agreed upon by the parties. Often it's based upon collections. There can be some fixed elements that are shared equally among the care centers. But essentially the takeaway from that is the CBO, hopefully, if it's structured properly, will pull away some of the costs that were originally incurred by the legacy entities, pull them into a central office where the costs can be improved on a per capita basis based upon economies of scale. And the larger the organization and the more the individual groups are willing to give up that administrative function to the CBO, the more everyone saves on a per capita basis. Let's talk about governance now. So the governance of a supergroup is typically in the form of a board of directors. The board of directors, as opposed to the members individually. If it required a membership vote to do anything to do everything within the organization, you'd get very little done, especially as you grow in size. Imagine 50 doctors trying to vote on everything. So what typically happens is there's a board that represents the members. What I mean by represents the members is, in most instances, you want the board to be very representative of the members. So for groups, for the practices that join the organization, especially larger practices, they might want a representative, at least from their practice or from a practice that's within their region, on the board, so that they feel represented by the board. So the board is a representation of the membership, and the board makes all day-to-day decisions on behalf of the organization, usually meets monthly once the practice is underway, and even makes some high-level decisions, except for those decisions that are specifically reserved for the membership, which are, in most cases, a limited number of decisions, such as entering into a large amount of debt, entering into a sale event to a third party, maybe terminating a large insurance payer, things of that nature. What is an MSO? An MSO is an organization typically owned by one or more founding physicians within the supergroup that provides all of the central business office, all the CBO functions, and then charges the practice a management fee, an agreed upon management fee, usually based upon a percentage of the overall revenue. And that revenue is then paid to the management company, and the management company is a separate entity outside of the practice that generates income and potentially profits for its members. So it's a vendor-vendee relationship with insiders involved in both sides of the transaction. Why form an MSO? Well, many of my clients form an MSO for a couple reasons. One reason is that they want to differentiate the ownership of a founding member from the ownership of individuals that join later. So for example, MSO ownership may only be permitted among founding members, so that the members that come subsequent to that don't profit on the MSO, or they don't profit immediately and have the option to buy into the MSO at some later date. Another advantage of an MSO is readily made to take on private equity investment, because private equity typically in most states cannot directly invest in a medical practice because you have to be a licensed physician. But an MSO does not require the ownership of licensed physicians, and therefore it expands the scope of how many potential purchasers there are in the marketplace, and private equity can directly invest in an MSO without having to redo the structure later on, and that makes for an easier transaction if you want investment dollars in the future. Another reason to form an MSO is that an MSO becomes a creditor of the practice, and that as a creditor of the practice, that MSO competes with potential future plaintiff creditors, judgment creditors. Let's talk briefly about the nuts and bolts of a supergroup. Just some random things that are, I think, frequently asked questions. One is, what happens to my employees when I join a supergroup? And the way we form supergroups is we make all of the employees now of the new entity. They still continue to work at the offices of the care centers, but they are employees in every way, every respect of the new entity. Another question is, what happens to my old practice, the legacy entity? In most instances, the groups that we form want to keep their old entity, their legacy entity, intact. It will no longer practice medicine after the go-live date, unless there are certain carve-outs, such as elective procedures that the group wants to be done outside of the new group practice. But for the most part, the practice of medicine will be completely transferred over to the new group. The legacy entity, however, will continue to, in many cases, own the hard assets, continue to lease the space directly from whatever landlord they're negotiating with. And the reason for that is we don't necessarily want a transaction whereby the supergroup takes on all those assets and liabilities unless there's some specific reason for it. If, for example, you've got 15 groups joining the supergroup, and the supergroup is now responsible for 15 different leases or more, depending on how much space each care center has, that's a lot of liability that the group takes on. So wherever possible, we have the legacy entity retain the lease and then sublease or license that that facility, that location, over to the supergroup pursuant to an agreed upon fee structure. The fee is a pass-through back to that care center, so it doesn't make too much of a difference as long as it's within the boundaries of fair market value. So in conclusion, supergroups provide a very important opportunity for physicians in an age when the private practice of medicine is under assault. Physicians are the only participants in the healthcare system that understand the full panoply of how to treat patients, and they have been left out of the discussion in many cases. Supergroups is one mechanism for physicians to take back some of that power.